City Japan campus. I'm Robert Dejarik from ICAS. First, just a few housekeeping notes. We are recording this session, audio and video, so when you ask questions, if you don't want your voice to be recorded, just speak from your seat. If not, come up to the mic. Secondly, if you have a mobile phone, put it on vibrate or terminate it. Three, if you didn't get invited from our email list and you'd like to be on our email list, you can leave your business cards here, or you can give me your card and we'll add you to our email list. Brevity is a sort of wit. You surely didn't come to hear me. So now I'll give the floor to our three panelists, and this will be followed by our Q&A session. So
thank you all very much for coming out tonight. We're here, of course, to plug our book. I credit James Brown here with the idea. He came to me burning, we were at a sports bar, looking at the soccer. He might remember it differently. And, usually people there, they're looking at the game, they're talking politics, slagging Trump. James looked troubled. I said, what's going on? He goes, there isn't a good, decent book on Japanese foreign relations with Asia. I said, well, we can fill that gap. So we rounded out a big posse of some of the great experts around the world, and that's all gathered there in that book. There really is no competition. I mean, the only other book that you could buy on this subject is like that thick, costs a lot, weighs a lot, and it's not written as well. Right? The really long chapters. Our chapters are like 6,000 words, nice little bite-sized chapters boiled down to the essence. And so I highly recommend this and thank James for coming to me and suggesting we do this. I wrote two chapters. The first is the introduction that sort of lays the foundation for the rest of the chapters, so everybody didn't have to recapitulate what happened between World War II and 1990. So I focused on Japan's Cold War Asian policy. I talk a great deal about the San Francisco Treaty and the San Francisco system. I think it has a lot to answer for. Because they excluded countries like China, the Koreas, and Russia, it meant it was rather incomplete. And it sowed the seeds of current conflict, for example, all the territorial disputes that Japan has. And I am going out on a limb and saying that Japan does have a territorial dispute with China, even though it denies it does. China, Korea, and Russia, all of those, the seeds were sowed back at the San Francisco Treaty because it's very vague on all of those. I think the San Francisco system essentially was the Cold War blueprint. It divided Asia, and I think it also postponed reconciliation over historical grievances, which I think have actually simmered and grown bigger over time and made Japan's position in Asia much more difficult. The other thing I want to talk about is how the security treaty, which was part of that, transformed Okinawa into a Cold War island. And so that, again, is one of the legacies that's being battled today by Okinawans against the central government and against Washington. This brings me to Taiwan, which is my other chapter, and it's often been described as a Cold War iceberg that's not yet melting. Chapter title is Shadow Boxing, which is basically Japan, his fancy footwork, its jabbing, taunting, but never quite striking, never essentially inciting China to take action. Essentially, it's gesture diplomacy, and it's backed up, of course, by pragmatic problem solving. Japan does have some issues with Taiwan, but the good news on Taiwan, it's one of the only countries in Asia where history is not a problem at all. The interesting thing is it used to be until the late 80s. Before the late 80s, Japan was vilified. But since the late 80s, due to democratization and the battles between the parties to woo Japan, actually Japan's historical relationship with Taiwan improved, and now there's a great deal of nostalgia for the colonial era. So that's a big plus. Under Abe, clearly there's been a strong effort to strengthen relations. There was a meeting with a Taiwan representative on the sidelines of APEC. These sorts of little gestures are enough to annoy China, but not enough to provoke anything. But interestingly, it was back in 1997 when Japan adopted the first US-Japan defense guidelines, and I think it was Seiroko Kajiyama in a press conference said, yes, of course, the guidelines apply to Taiwan. And he wasn't supposed to say that because they're not officially supposed to do that. So that led to the expression that they are, was it, they're not geographical, but they are situational. So it's a situational, not a geographical application, which was their way of dancing away from the problematic stance that Seiroko Kajiyama had articulated. Now, Japan also has a great deal of soft power in Taiwan, also unlike, in a way, Korea. Also, there's been a quadrupling of Taiwanese tourists coming here. There's lots of nomads, students, and workers coming from Taiwan, and they have a very strong, robust economic relationship. So Taiwan, I think, is one of the big success stories of Japan's foreign relations in Asia. That's enough on my two chapters. I just want to throw out some other things going on here. You know, a lot of people these days in the media make a big deal about Trump's America First policy. And I think for the Japanese, that's old news. Since when hasn't American foreign policy been America First? The San Francisco Treaty System made Japan into a client state. Basically, when Washington said jump, Japan had to say how high. So the big difference isn't that America is imposing its foreign policy on Japan. The big difference is who is in charge. And I think that we've seen over the last week, you know, that even if you are Donald Trump's best friend among world leaders, it doesn't really count for much, given the blindsiding of Abe over Trump's decision to meet with Kim. This took, I think, the government here totally by surprise, and Abe had been the one constantly saying, no talking for the sake of talking. And here Trump is going to be talking, and, well, we'll see how that works out. But clearly now the Japanese government is quickly scrambling to make itself more relevant in the process. Clearly, Abe has been upstaged by Moon, and South Korea is in the driver's seat on this in a way that I think Abe finds very infuriating and embarrassing. The other thing I have to say about Abe and South Korea is his statue obsession is so counterproductive. His new ambassador to America says one of his priorities is to remove all the comfort women statues in the United States. I can imagine if that really is his priority, that's not going to really work out too well for them. And so I think that the 2015 agreement, Moon said he would abide by it after sort of hosing it down and saying, well, and Abe has to do more. I think the big shock here was that Tillerson then afterwards said, yeah, I think Abe needs to do more too. So when Abe met Moon, he said, well, Moon, I think you got to do more. Not only do you got to remove that statue in front of the embassy, I want you to remove all the statues all over the world. So that agreement that irreversibly resolved the comfort woman issue is still percolating along. I'd say those problems aren't going to go away anytime soon. There's been much talk of the quadrilateral relationship in the Indo-Pacific. Australia, United States, Japan, and India are going to forge a common front to counter China. I don't know what they're dreaming. I don't think that's ever going to really work out. Clearly, India is not on board a containing China strategy. And I'm writing a new book now, and one of the things I've been focusing on is on the Rohingya problem in Myanmar. And Japan's always touting its value-based foreign policy. And I know, don't roll your eyes too much, but anyway, remember the arc of freedom and prosperity? Well, anyway, what has Japan done about this massive humanitarian crisis that's led to the exodus of 700,000 Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh? I happened to be in Dhaka when Kono visited the refugee camps. But other than that, I don't think they've really done too much. Anyway, I'll leave it there. There's a lot certainly to talk about. We'll have to assess whether Abe, back in 2013 when he went to America and Washington, I was at CSIS, and he said, Japan is back and so am I. I think that the declining Japan story has been overdone. And I think that this book helps explain why Japan still remains very relevant and very influential. With that, I'll hand over to Dan Sneider.
Okay. So I'm one of the contributors to this book, and I want to thank James and Jeff for inviting me to be part of the volume, and it really came out really well, I think, and I'm planning to use it in my class as well. So there you go. It's successful from that point of view, and I also think that it does fill a very important hole in terms of looking at Japanese relations with Asia in particular. Now, because I think that we tend to look at everything in U.S.-Japan terms. Unfortunately, I'm going to speak a lot about the U.S.-Japan security relationship because what I wrote about looks at the evolution, the development of Japanese security policy in the era of collective self-defense. I'm happy to veer off into contemporary events, which I often write about, but I'll try and confine what I'm going to say now to that. But if the questions take us in a different direction, that's okay. So what I try to do is look at the changes in Japanese security policy broadly and towards Asia and put them in some kind of historical context. So there's a lot of debate amongst academics and to some degree policy experts about whether the changes in Japanese security policy represent an evolution of existing policy or a break from the past. And I think it's, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think it's also important, though, to look at whether, however we characterize it, to try and understand what those changes mean in real terms for Japan's global and I think more importantly Asian regional role. There's a big gap always when you look at Japanese security policy between rhetoric and reality and between expectations and reality, and I try and take a look at some of that. Now, I do want to sort of lay down one marker, which is that I know there is a lot of talk outside of Japan mainly, but I think even inside Japan, about the revival of Japanese militarism. I generally tend to regard most of that talk as ill-informed and overdrawn, though there is a kernel of truth to some of it. And the kernel is that we have seen, I think, since the beginning of this century, and certainly in an accelerated way since Prime Minister Abe came back to office at the end of 2012, a really rapid expansion of Japan's legal and technical capability to take on a broader security role, one that is, I think, well beyond the narrowly defined mission of Japan's self-defense. So there's been a lot of change, but at the same time, Japan's ability to carry out those kinds of missions continues to be in reality, very tightly constrained. It's tightly constrained by the ongoing legal restrictions on the use of force, including those that are embedded in the legislation that was passed. It's constrained by the realities of Japanese fiscal policy, by limited budgetary resources. It's constrained by the demographic reality of an aging and shrinking population. There just aren't the people out there to carry the guns, even if you wanted to send them off into war. And it's not least of all, most importantly, constrained by a public that remains deeply averse to the use of force and to the risk of the loss of Japanese life in combat. I always like to remind people that Japan is the only major power in the world that has not suffered a single loss of life in combat since the end of World War II. Now, I come from a country that has been perhaps continuously at war, and on some level or another during this entire period. And so Americans, I think, almost assume that everybody else has been engaged in some form of combat at some time or another. But the reality is, I think, is a remarkable and important fact that Japanese have no experience of war. There's not and they've shown almost no toleration of the sacrifice of life that the use of force inevitably entails. And, you know, that's very important when you think about what Japan is actually capable of doing. That said, it's undeniable that under Prime Minister Abe, we've seen the most significant developments in this area in the entire post-war period. And just sort of quickly sketch them to remind you, the Abe administration has established a National Security Council, released the first national security strategy for Japan. It revised the National Defense Program guidelines. Those are the policies that set broadly the structure and the force content of Japanese military. They've expanded defense spending, albeit incrementally. They announced new guidelines for U.S.-Japan defense cooperation, which is the first revision of those guidelines since 1997. They reinterpreted the Constitution in July of 2014 to allow for the exercise of the right of collective self-defense. And they passed a package of implementing legislation in October of 2015, which revises both existing laws and also adds a new international peace support law. So in principle now, Japanese military forces can be used in a variety of situations that are well short of responding simply to an armed attack on Japanese territory. Japanese can now provide logistical and other support to the armed forces of other countries. Japanese forces that are engaged in peacekeeping operations are now authorized to use force beyond their own self-defense. And I think most significantly, Japan can use force to respond to any situation, broadly defined, that threatens Japan's security, including an armed attack, quote, against a foreign country that is in a close relationship with Japan. That's a definition that goes well beyond the single security treaty ally Japan has, that is the United States, and could potentially include almost anybody. And that's been accompanied by a broadened Japanese security cooperation with a lot of other countries. There are the partnership relationships with countries like Australia and India, and in some sense, potentially, possibly South Korea. There's the provision of equipment and training to a number of countries in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. All this is really new. It's unprecedented in Japanese post-war history. The bans that existed previously on the export of military equipment have been effectively lifted, and Japanese are now selling equipment from patrol boats to aircraft and potentially other technology. We've seen a growing role of Japanese in carrying out joint training exercises, and now we see some potentially Japanese military trainers going to Southeast Asia. And on the U.S.-Japan front, there's a real shift towards joint contingency planning and coordination, particularly since Operation Tomodachi. I don't think most people realize that this is the only allied relationship the United States has in which we don't engage in that type of joint. There is no planning for joint operations between the United States and Japan. The U.S. and South Korea are joined in a combined command under which all of the South Korean military potentially would operate under the command of the four-star general, American general who runs U.S. Forces Korea in time of war. And we do extensive joint contingency planning. We do joint training exercises for wartime conditions, and we do that with our other allies in NATO. We do nothing like that with Japan, except in recent years we've begun to engage in that type of coordinated operations. And before the earthquake response, and that was a totally improvised operation. There's no provision for even forming a joint headquarters or a joint command to deal with any type of situation, whether it's humanitarian disasters or wartime. So now we actually have a structure to do that that is still somewhat of an not empty, but a structure that is yet to be fully operationalized, but it's there, and it wasn't there before. The Japanese are spending a lot of money on military systems that are frankly intended to tighten joint operations with the U.S. That includes things like missile defense systems, unmanned aircraft, Aegis-equipped surface ships, which effectively operate in coordination with the U.S. Navy. I mean, the one part of the Japanese military that has been working de facto in close coordination with the U.S. for a long time is the Navy. Japanese Navy, if you go down to Yokosuka, the 7th Fleet headquarters and the Japanese Fleet headquarters are right next to each other, and they coordinate on a very tight level. But a lot of that is sort of unofficial. And the Japanese are beginning to purchase equipment that effectively breaks the post-war taboos on offensive operations. I mean, traditionally, Japan did not possess any type of military equipment that could conceivably use to launch an attack on another country. It was all simply for self-defense, and that has been slowly evolving, but more rapidly in recent years, so that now the Japanese talk openly about launching preemptive strikes on North Korean missile facilities and so on. That never happened before the last few years. So, does this represent a clear break from the past, from this constrained role that Japan adopted at the end of the occupation? Jeff referred to sort of the reality is Japanese have always operated de facto as a subordinate part of the U.S. military presence in East Asia and the Western Pacific. Does it represent a break from the Yoshida Doctrine, the so-called Yoshida Doctrine? And there are some people who say, yes, we are now seeing the replacement of the Yoshida Doctrine with the Abe Doctrine. I don't agree with that for the most part, although I absolutely think we've seen a really accelerated pace of change. But everything that I've been talking about has actually been discussed almost in these terms since the middle of the 1950s, since the process began that led to the revision of the Security Treaty, and that includes the idea of Japan taking on a broader regional security role, as well as removing the limits on the exercise of collective self-defense. Now that happened in large part because of U.S. pressure for Japan to move in that direction, but it also was something that many Japanese themselves sought to happen. So I'd argue that what we're seeing is a evolution of security policy, but in kind of not in a sort of steady incremental fashion, but in a series of small leaps, if you will. And obviously U.S. pressure has been a constant, if you will, for the last 6 decades. Basically Americans have been hectoring the Japanese to do more, to take on a broader security role, to share more of the burden of collective defense, going back to the Cold War. But the other thing that I think is a very important factor is the sense of threat and the worries about abandonment, both of which are also a constant in Japanese foreign policy. And the perception of threat, even if you think about China and the discussion of China as a threat today in Japan, I'd argue that that's not new. If you go back to the mid-1960s when the Chinese started testing nuclear weapons the first time, that caused a huge crisis in Japanese security and foreign policy thinking. There were worries about abandonment then. There was talk about going nuclear then. So threat perception has been there, but it's waxed and it's waned depending upon the circumstances. I think the growth of Soviet strength in the Far East was a factor for a while. Obviously, the sense of the fear of a vacuum being created after the American defeat in Vietnam was very important in Japanese thinking. But I think it's certainly taken a different direction since the 1990s when the North Korean nuclear and missile program became visible and when the Chinese embarked upon this rather amazing level of massive military spending, a double-digit increases in Chinese military spending, a more than doubling of China's defense budget in a very short period of time, and its assertion of its sort of claims to de facto hegemony in the East and South China Seas. So, despite all that, I would argue that while Abe has been very successful in creating a much wider legal justification for the projection of Japanese military force beyond its borders, and while he has expanded Japan's regional security role, certainly potentially well beyond what it was before, he's actually failed completely to convince the Japanese public of that necessity. I'm always amazed that the opinion poll numbers on these questions, whether we're talking about the change in the Article 9 of the Constitution, or even any type of polling that asks Japanese about the use of force, those numbers have not budged. 5 years of Abe, 5 years of threat environment that is being trumpeted all the time, North Korea and so on, but those polling numbers don't change. And that's despite the LDP's political domination and the conservative tilt of much of the Japanese media. And I think even if you take Korea, which is perhaps the best case that can be made for Japan to play a regional security role, there are massive barriers to the exercise of that, even of these theoretical rights that have been created. First of all, the Koreans themselves don't want Japan to play that role. That's different from, say, in Vietnam or the Philippines, where there apparently is an interest in Japan playing that role. But the Japanese public is not interested in it either. So, the best, even, and I use this case at the beginning of my chapter, even in the case of peacekeeping operations, which are the most acceptable form of the use of force by Japan, under the aegis of the United Nations, under the UN Charter, all those things. So Japanese, the changes in security legislation allowed for Japanese peacekeeping forces to be able to engage in what are called peace enforcement operations. So not just peacekeeping, but actually dealing with an ongoing combat situation, active civil war. And the Japanese troops that were deployed to the south of Sudan, were given new rules of engagement based on this legislation, and a whole new set of forces was sent a year ago. But the Japanese government lied, basically, about the circumstances in South Sudan and lied before the Diet because the rules had said previously you can't go into a situation where it's not an established ceasefire. They didn't tell the truth about that. And when it became evident that there was, in fact, real danger there, that is, Japanese troops could be actually shot at and killed, they were withdrawn a year into the operation, which is pretty interesting because it tells you that the Japanese government and the Abe administration perceived quite accurately that the Japanese public had very little toleration for the risk involved, even in exposing themselves in the course of a peacekeeping operation. So, which is why I don't join the sort of alarmist view of the revival of Japanese militarism that you hear now and again. So I think evolution is still ongoing, and since the world we live in is so completely unstable and unpredictable, including the role of the U.S., it's impossible to know where things go ultimately. I mean, I think if the United States were to withdraw in a serious way from its international commitments and from any real willingness to carry out its obligations under our security treaty with Japan, then, you know, things could change here. But for the moment, I'm not an alarmist. So, thank you.
Thank you to Dan Sneider for contributing an excellent chapter, and thank you also to Jeff Kingston, my co-editor. So the original idea might indeed have come from me, but I don't think the book certainly would have come out on time had it not been for the driving force of Jeff Kingston. He's edited several books. This is my first edited volume, and he certainly showed me how to do it. So thank you very much for that. So I contributed one full chapter, which was the one on Japan-Russia relations, which is where much of my research focuses. But I also wrote the introduction to the volume as well. So what I wanted to do today is, first of all, to really talk about what I cover in the chapter, which includes some really quite basic things to do with Japan-Russia relations, but then also to relate it to more recent contemporary developments in this bilateral relationship, which is particularly important to Prime Minister Abe. So first of all, about the chapter itself. So the way that it's framed is as unfulfilled potential of this relationship. At the end of the Cold War, we have all of this hope about a potential rapprochement between the two sides. Of course, during the Cold War, the main perceived security threat for Japan was the threat from the Soviet Union. There was, as a result, a great concentration of the self-defense forces in Hokkaido, protecting against the potential for actually a Soviet invasion of northern Japan. With the end of the Cold War, there were hopes that these two countries that are actually such close neighbors could begin to work more closely together, because really the distance between the two countries is so little. The closest point, it's actually 3.7 kilometers between the two. Now, that's actually territory that, according to the Japanese government, is under occupation by Russia. But even if you take a less controversial point, the point between Hokkaido and Sakhalin that you can see on the map there, that is only around 40 kilometers. So really very close geographically. But these hopes have not been fulfilled. And you can see this from some of the details listed here. There are periodic political tensions between the two sides. These come up every few years. Some of the more serious ones were the withdrawal of the Japanese ambassador from Russia in 2010 as a result of the visit by then President Medvedev to the disputed territory. Also, more recently, you had the imposition of sanctions on Russia by Japan, albeit quite reluctantly, but still they went ahead with introducing these in response to the annexation of Crimea. And whilst those might be some of the most prominent, you have many other points of tension where diplomatic protests are made from the Japanese side towards Russia. For example, for positioning, making military deployments on the disputed islands and other things as well. Added to this, if you look at the economic trade, it's not very impressive. You can see there that 2016, it was $16.4 billion bilateral turnover, up a bit last year to around 18.7 billion. But really, that's not a huge amount of bilateral trade. I mean, you compare it with Japan-China, perhaps that's not surprising. China is such a large economy, that's 260 billion odd. But if you compare it also to a trading relationship such as that between Japan and Singapore, there too, that bilateral trade significantly more, $26 billion rather than the around sort of $19 billion between Japan and Russia. Also, for such close geographic neighbors, there's really quite limited people-to-people exchange too. This might have something to do with the negative attitudes that prevail in Japan towards their northern neighbor. A survey by the Cabinet Office recently showed that 76.9% of Japanese feel unfriendly or somewhat unfriendly feelings towards Russia. On the Russian side, it's a much more positive attitude towards Japan. But if you look at the visitor numbers too, these have been going up significantly in recent years, but still, last year, only around 77,000 Russians visited Japan. You compare that with the more than 800,000 from South Korea and around 350,000 from Taiwan. So this relationship, as I say in the title, is still defined by unfulfilled potential. And so my purpose in the chapter is to try and explain why that is the case. Now, the most obvious factor is the territorial dispute related to these islands off the northeast coast of Hokkaido. But what I want to do in the chapter is to highlight that it's really too simplistic to say that this is the main reason for the problems in the relationship. Instead, in the chapter, I want to highlight that whilst this is of course an issue, there are actually, in some ways, more significant underlying problems in the relationship. Were it not for these other underlying problems, there would be the potential to maybe not solve the dispute, but at least perhaps shelve it or reduce the problems related to it. So what are these underlying difficulties? Well, the first one is geopolitical, and this is perhaps the most important one. Japan's relationship with the United States, at least from the view of the Russian side, remains a major thorn in this relationship. And this has been a historical issue, but is one which continues to this day. So when Jeff was introducing his historical chapter, he mentioned the continued importance of the San Francisco Treaty, and this certainly applies here as well. And in the way that the San Francisco Treaty is written, it in a sense creates the situation leading to the continuation of this territorial dispute, because it says there that Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to the Kuril Islands. This is a document signed, of course, by Japan, not signed by the Soviet Union, but still, this would seem to bind Japan to having given up its claim to those islands. However, in the way that it is written, and this we know was a deliberate intention of the US side, no definition was provided for what the Kuril Islands were. So that created the opportunity for the Japanese side to say, well, the Kuril Islands apply to the islands which are north of the largest island pictured there, Etorofu or Iturup. So Japan then can say that it gave up those other islands, but these are not Kuril Islands. They are instead a different geological entity, subsequently known as the Northern Territories. And this was a deliberate policy of the United States, in some ways quite clever diplomacy. You create the conditions for a territorial dispute, thereby preventing Japan and the Soviet Union from becoming too close during the Cold War era. Similar motivations led to the rejection of a potential deal in 1956. So although a peace treaty still does not exist between Japan and Russia, it's not correct to say that the two sides are still at war. And that's because a joint declaration was signed in 1956, which ended the state of war and came quite close to actually settling the territorial dispute. At this time, the Soviet Union offered to return, or rather transfer, the two smaller islands to Japan after the signing of a peace treaty. However, When it seemed like Japan was perhaps moving towards considering accepting that, the United States made clear that it was not happy about the potential settlement of the dispute with the transfer of territory effectively to the Soviet Union, with the recognition that the larger islands would remain Soviet territory. And then Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, in a famous intervention, warned the Japanese side that if they made that deal with the Soviet Union, then the United States might remain forever in Okinawa. So, ensuring that the territorial dispute continued. Now, this was Cold War stuff. Subsequently, the United States has been much more positive, or at least during the 1990s, about the prospects of resolving the dispute, really quite in favor of that. But still, the status of Japan as the US's most important, the status of the Japan-US alliance is still a major problem, especially for the Russian side. And so, over the last few years, when Abe has really pushed forward with this attempt to resolve the dispute, Russian concerns about what this might mean for the United States have presented an obstacle. So last year during the summer, President Putin said publicly that one of the problems about potentially transferring territory to Japan is that if they come under the sovereignty of Japan, there is the possibility that US military bases could be placed there. Now, when this happened, the Russian media immediately focused on it, and what you can see in the picture there is a mock-up photo which was produced by one of the Russian media companies showing what it would look like if you had US military deployed on these disputed islands. In addition, the involvement of the US has also been an issue related to Aegis Ashore. So as you'll know, Japan decided to go for the deployment of this additional missile defense system, and the Russian side responded very, very forcefully to this, warning that it would have a negative impact on negotiations to do with the peace treaty, and also Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov saying that Aegis Ashore's deployment represents a new situation which we logically must take account of in our military planning. We urge our Japanese colleagues to reflect on whether it is in their interests to become complicit in the violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Okay, so all of this indicates that one of the problems in the relationship is that when Russia looks at Japan, Russia primarily still sees a US ally. And so that's an underlying obstacle. But there are others as well. And a further one, which has still not been overcome, is the psychological issue. It could be characterized that whilst they are such close geographic neighbors, they've spent much of their history with their backs to each other, certainly during the Cold War period anyway. This has something to do with the Eurocentric focus of Russia. That, after all, is where much of the Russian population is concentrated, and it's only been periodic that the Russian side has placed more emphasis on its relations with Asia, one of those eras being just now. There are also historical issues affecting this relationship. They might not be so serious as those between Japan and South Korea or those between Japan and China, but they are still a problem which perhaps explains why there is so much negative sentiment within Japan towards its northern neighbor. So there is the perception that the Soviet Union stabbed Japan in the back at the end of the Second World War. As you might recall, during most of that conflict, the Soviet Union and Japan were not at war. Instead, they had a neutrality pact between the two of them, which had been signed in April 1941. And it was only in the last few days of the conflict, on the evening of August the 8th, 1945, that the Soviet Union ended conclusively the pact and declared war on Japan. So this, sometimes in Japanese writings about this period, is described as stabbing Japan in the back, or indeed the seizing of the islands, which came subsequent to that, being an action of like a thief at a fire. And the reason why that's seen as being so illegitimate is because the occupation of these now disputed islands took place after Japan's announcement of its intention to surrender, so coming after August the 15th. At the time, the islands, which had been under Japanese control officially since 1855, they had a Japanese population of around 17,000. They were subsequently expelled from the islands, and around 1/3 of them remain alive today. So this is another sort of emotional, historical issue. And a final one, which relates to the picture there, is that with the end of the Second World War, according to the details of the Potsdam Declaration, surrendering Japanese forces should have been allowed to return home. However, in the case of those who were in territory taken by the Soviet Union, more than 600,000 of them were actually transferred to Siberia and to Mongolia, where they were required to engage in forced labor. Now, around 62,000 of them died when they were there from hunger, from exposure. And the picture there is from a museum in Japan which remembers the plight of those individuals. So all of those issues lead to this lingering feeling of anger against Russia and its Soviet predecessor. Some academics, however, have suggested that this anger plays a different role as well, in that at the end of the Second World War, there was a lot of potential feeling of anger towards the United States. However, with the US becoming Japan's major ally, that anger was no longer sort of helpful. It was indeed problematic. So therefore, finding a way to redirect that frustration away from Japan's former major adversary and towards the Cold War adversary of the Soviet Union was therefore quite helpful. In addition, finding one element of the Second World War in which Japan was the victim rather than the victimizer was also seen as being, in some ways, useful. Okay, final explanation of lingering problems before I move on to a few contemporary things. The issue of what might be described as cold economics, cold politics. In other problematic relationships that Japan has, for example, in its relationship with China, there remains an underlying logic for closer relations. There remains a lobby, an economic lobby, a business lobby within Japan looking to try and overcome political issues in order to gain the commercial benefits. In the case of Japan-Russia relations, however, that business lobby doesn't really exist so much. Now, certainly, there are opportunities for more trade between the two. Russia looking for high-tech investment, and Japan looking for natural resource imports. But that level of trade more or less already exists, where there's a major incentive for Japanese companies to go into the Russian market. They have done so. A big example of that would be the Sakhalin-2 project, in which two of the largest Japanese companies are involved. But why is it that more Japanese companies do not invest in Russia? Is it because of the absence of a peace treaty? Is it because of the territorial dispute? I would say no, it's not. Actually, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Japanese companies, which can often be quite risk-averse, do not simply see it as a profitable market, and are also concerned about the lack of legal protections there. That, I think, is a bigger obstacle. And interestingly, a few days ago, JETRO released a new survey which they conducted of Japanese businesses, asking them about which countries they considered most attractive for expansion. And the top four was China, Vietnam, Thailand, and the United States. I looked in the reporting of the survey if there was any mention of Russia whatsoever. There was none. This despite the fact that Abe has put so much emphasis on improving economic ties between the two countries, appointing a minister for economic cooperation with Russia, launching an 8-point economic cooperation plan in May 2016, visiting the Vladivostok Eastern Economic Forum in 2 years in a row. It's also expected that he will go to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in May, at the same time as visiting Moscow. And a final one there, that Japan last year was the partner country of Russia's largest trade expo in Yekaterinburg. So all of this emphasis has been placed on the economic relationship by Abe. Japanese companies don't seem to want to respond. Okay, so those are the underlying factors. How does this apply to the present day? Well, Abe has this ambitious plan which is based on the following few points. He believes that perhaps progress can be made on moving towards a peace treaty by building close personal relations with Putin. This is seen as being a window of opportunity because with Putin being such a strong leader with such good nationalist credentials, maybe he could overcome Russian public opposition to a territorial transfer. So he has placed huge emphasis on trying to build a rapport, a degree of trust with the Russian leader. And so that's why they have met 20 times, and also trying to establish a more personal relationship by pushing for this informal summit which took place in Nagato in December 2016. Wasn't entirely successful, not least because Putin turned up 3 hours late and also refused to go in the onsen. That Putin has also been somewhat reluctant, I've heard, said, to move to first name terms. So Abe suggested, okay, let's call each other Vladimir and Shinzo. And apparently, Russian president wasn't too keen on the idea, but it's quite hard to directly say no. So if you look at when they do the joint press conferences, Abe is much more enthusiastic about calling Putin Vladimir rather than vice versa. Another thing that is part of Abe's plan, in addition to those economic incentives that I already mentioned, was actually softening significantly Japan's demand. For much of previous decades, Japan's position was something which is described as the sort of entrance position. And what that means is that until Russia showed some sort of concessions, then Japan wouldn't move forward with better political and economic ties. Now, Abe's entirely abandoned that. Instead, he has front-loaded the political and economic cooperation in the hope that that will create a positive dynamic which would lead to an exit, which would be some sort of deal. So he's not even pushing really for a return of all of the 4 islands. Instead, he's going for something more achievable, he hopes, which is joint economic activities on the islands under a special legal framework which would be separate from Russian sovereignty. So that would allow Japanese companies and individuals to return to the islands in a meaningful way. They've not been there since they were expelled shortly after the Second World War. Also, Abe's pushed for increasing access for those former Japanese residents that I mentioned previously, including by having a charter flight which ran in September last year. He has also put a sort of time limit on this, saying that he's committed to resolving this issue and signing a peace treaty before the end of his time in office. Now, given all of the rumors about the potential for resignation, maybe he doesn't have as much time as we all believed, but the expectation is that if he does remain in position, then he will make a trip to Russia at the end of May, hoping for a real breakthrough. But my final slide here is to highlight that we've seen a lot of this before. In fact, we've seen a remarkably similar approach which happened during the 1990s, during the time of Prime Minister Hatoyama. So you can see him there pictured with Yeltsin. And his approach was very, very similar to that of Abe's. He really pressed for close personal relations with Yeltsin. They went to first name terms. They also held these informal summits, 2 of them. They were described as no-tie summits. And the first of those was in Krasnoyarsk, the next one in Kawana. And Hatoyama also reduced his demands in terms of territorial resolution. moving away from a demand for 4 islands to be returned at once, and instead in what was described as the Kawana proposal, suggesting that the islands could be demarcated so that the border would officially put the islands under Japan's sovereignty, yet that the islands would remain under Russian administrative control for an unspecified period, and also there would be joint economic activities. So many of the components are the same, including economic incentives, although it wasn't an 8-point economic cooperation plan then, it was just 6. Not sure if the addition of 2 is going to make that much difference. They placed the target, and this was actually from Yeltsin, to resolve this by the end of the year 2000. But clearly that didn't happen. So my conclusion, linking those earlier points with the current situation, is that Abe has put a lot of energy, a lot of effort into this, but unless the underlying fundamentals change of Japan's closer relationship with the United States and Russia's difficult relationship with the US, of the psychological issues and the absence of really significant economic incentives, unless those things change, then Abe's prospects are no better than those of Hatoyama. And my closing image here is that from a few weeks ago. Japan celebrates the Day of the Northern Territories on the 7th of February. On that day, Russia decided to conduct military activities on the islands, a snap exercise, and it finished off with raising the Russian flag above the islands in a clearly provocative step directed towards Japan. So I think that really symbolizes the underlying difficulties that remain in this relationship and the poor prospects for Abe's plan. Okay, thank you very much.
Let's get the ball rolling then. My name is Daniel Giles. I'm with GR Japan Government Relations Consultancy. For those of you here last time, I spent a long time in Southeast Asia, so I'm going to ask about Southeast Asia again because it didn't really speak to it yet. In ASEAN, ASEAN likes to think of itself as everybody's friend. It's geographically, strategically located amongst some major powers, and it doesn't see itself as a threat to anybody else. China increasingly seems to be playing a very nuanced and smart sort of diplomatic dance with Southeast Asia, undermining ASEAN's solidity in various ways and increasing its investment. Japan for the long time has been the main economic player, quiet player in across Southeast Asia. I'm just wondering, maybe there's a chapter in the book, but I'm just wondering if Japan's diplomatic posture in Southeast Asia has changed dramatically in the last sort of decade or so as China has become very more visible across the region.
Thank you. Actually, there are a number of chapters related to that. Chapter on Burma, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, to some extent Vietnam. Clearly, there is a strong rivalry, and it's been increasing in recent years. The author on Burma seems to think that Japan is more or less holding its own. I'm a little more skeptical on that score. The writer on Indonesia thinks there is much closer relations between Indonesia and Japan. And as you know, there are various problems historically with China and the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia, and concerns about the economic overpresence of China, and also there are the rivalry in Natuna. So I think that essentially Japan's trump card here is that there is an arc of anxiety that stretches across Southeast Asia about China's hegemonic ambitions, and the fact that China has intervened in ASEAN, I guess you'd call it astutely, is because the ASEAN way is unanimous consensus. And so by buying off Laos and Cambodia, more or less they've got their bets covered. So ASEAN basically has been sort of taken off the board, and that I think is frustrating to Japan. But Abe, I'd say I'd give him fairly high marks on his Southeast Asian diplomacy, lots of visits, lots of projects, lots of commitments. He hasn't been particularly strong, I guess, on values. Duterte is a bit of a difficult partner, but he sort of overlooked his drawbacks. The democratic backsliding in Thailand, Japan has not raised any real concerns there. Hasn't really spoken out condemning the government in Myanmar about the treatment of Rohingya. And Jokowi in Indonesia, I mean, he's also engaged in a drug war, lots of extrajudicial killings as well, and he's not been called out on the carpet. So I think Japan has sort of put its values aside and say, well, you know, we have to sort of play the game a bit more like China, and they've done, I'd say, as well as could be expected given the situation. I think there is a huge power shift towards China.
Richard Salmons from Australian National University. Thanks very much for such a great book. I read the chapter on Japan's naval diplomacy, and that's an incredibly topical and useful chapter. So the thing I'm interested in is looking just, I suppose, from Australia's point of view. There is always talk about a greater Japan-Australia security tie-up, and Abe has often talked about the Quad, various other relationships. There was the talk about the sale of submarines to Australia and a related security relationship. But what I'm interested in is what can Japan do for the security of a country like Australia? Well, not necessarily focusing on Australia if you don't want to, but just as an example, if we're looking at these sort of offers of a greater security relationship with Japan, what's in it for Australia?
Well, I think the same thing that's in it for other potential partners or existing partners throughout Asia is that people who are looking for balancing with China, and certainly that's a huge question in Australia these days, as far as I know, that Japan, I think the fact that Abe has been more assertive about Japan playing a regional security role, and that includes carrying out joint exercises with the Australians, and I believe they've gone beyond that. I mean, they've got an intelligence sharing agreement. They've actually begun to even talk about some kinds of joint contingency planning. I think it allows Japan to play a little bit more of an active, credible balancing role. Obviously, to some degree, it's a subset, if you will, of the United States in that sense. I think Japan as an independent security actor is not realistic. And I think that's recognized in Japanese security policy because it isn't talked about in a really realistically in a totally bilateral context. But I think as far as I'm concerned, that we haven't seen this kind of thing previously. And I think even in the Australian case, it would have been unthinkable maybe 15, 20 years ago. So I think that's a real change. I mean, even the export of weapons question and the Australia submarine sale was a sort of disastrous first venture on the part of the Japanese to get a major defense contract. They approached it in typical fashion. That is, they thought they had basically a backroom understanding between the Australian Premier and Prime Minister Abe, which I believe they did, actually, but then government changed in Australia, and they didn't focus very well on the business and technical aspects of it. The French and the Germans as well both offered production arrangements in Australia, which were much more sensitive to the needs of the Australian sort of domestic politics of Australia. So they're learning, in that sense. I mean, this is all new for them. Japanese had never done that kind of weapons sales previously. But I think that's still, again, I mean, all those kinds of things are at least little markers of change. I don't think, again, it doesn't change the fundamental strategic sort of dynamics of the region, but makes it a little more interesting.
Jill, you're here. You're second here.
Gilles Campagnolo from the French National Center for Scientific Research, and also a former specially appointed professor at Hokkaido University in Sapporo. I mentioned it because the question will be for James, but thank you to all three for the talk, about Russia and Japan. I coordinated a program for the European Union. It was called Liberalism in between Europe and China, but there was also Japan included, and I was on the road like you last year in order to present the book, wherein there is a chapter about Russia and Japan. And we had the chance to work with two colleagues from Ulan-Ude, Buryat Republic, Siberia. And Siberia was, well, Krasnoyarsk was mentioned for a meeting, but Siberia was a little bit absent, not present in your talk. So my question is about that. As the global coordinator of that heavy thing, my impression was that they were, our colleagues, quite enthusiastic, actually, about this thing. Quite converse to the image that you gave of the bosses, of the big chiefs on both sides. It seemed to me that these colleagues from Siberia were expecting something. And I saw it coming from China with massive FDIs, but they didn't see it coming enough from Japan, at least to their taste. They mentioned how there were meetings since 2012 in Moscow with the big top executives of companies, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, etc. But that was not followed really by results, practical results. So they tried to inquire about it. One of the things they were keen on saying is that even after the collapse of the USSR, the Russia's image had not changed significantly in the eyes of the Japanese. And they were sorry for that. But the other thing that they said, and this is where my question comes at last, is that politics was not where things could be moved. Because either on one side or at the other, there will be something blocking at some point. But they were expecting private, liberal, let's say, or capitalist companies, firms, investment to do the trick. They listed that, of course, and they were the first to recognize that in Siberia they had, like Russia, a bureaucratized management system, imperfect legislation, lack of qualified personnel, and obvious endemic bribery. Now, those are reasons enough that there is no business. But at the same time, they were saying that it would be up to the FDI bringing companies, then to the Japanese companies, to adapt the features of their own working to this situation in order to get the tremendous rewards that they could find in the wealth and abundance of things that were not things. So my question, based on that experience as a coordinator and seeing their reactions, my question is, can these problems that I mentioned be overcome by Japanese companies adapting to such situation? If yes, is there any future foreseeable? If not, why? And is it should I say to my colleagues that I have to despair and that's all?
Thank you very much. First thing I need to say, though, is that I just checked my slides, and in horror I see that I didn't have Hashimoto as the Prime Minister listed. I had Hatoyama listed there. It should have been Hashimoto, so apologies for that terrible mistake. As for the excellent question there, that about first of all, the regional relations between the two. Yeah, I mean, I've spent some time at the Far Eastern Federal University in Vladivostok, and they're very much in favor of closer ties with Japan. Indeed, for many decades, Siberia and parts of the Russian Far East have had really quite good regional relations with parts of Japan like Niigata, like Hokkaido. But both countries remain so centralized that actually, even if regional leaders remain very enthusiastic, those sorts of small-scale kind of types of cooperation can never really become that much more significant. As to the issue of economic cooperation, I think there perhaps has been a little bit of a change in recent years. In the Russian side now doesn't seem to be saying, well, you must just adapt to our investment climate. Instead, they are saying, we have made our investment climate more attractive. One of the goals of the Putin administration over the last few years has been to move up the rankings in the ease of doing business. And they've been very successful in that regard. Some people say that, well, they've just learned how to kind of game the system, as many other kind of countries do. But nonetheless, I think there have been improvements. Also, in parts of the country, they've set up what are more or less the equivalent of special economic zones. So the Russian side is saying, well, yes, come and invest. Don't expect, however, that this is going to lead to concessions on the territorial dispute, that we want to do more business. Let's both do business together and kind of have mutual benefits, but let's not tie it with the territorial dispute. An additional problem I see is a little bit of an inconsistency between the economic goals of the two leaders. So I mentioned those 8 points of economic cooperation. They tend to be really quite kind of practical goals. And when Prime Minister Abe was most recently in Vladivostok, he talked about really practical projects like setting up traffic lights so that the sequencing is better, so it reduces congestion. Also a way of repairing pipes so you don't actually have to dig up the roads. And the Russian politicians were completely unimpressed by that. That's not what they're interested in. They want mega projects. And at the same summit, first Deputy Prime Minister Shuvalov talked about the potential for a bridge between Hokkaido and Sakhalin. So they want these really eye-catching, enormous projects, critics would say, so that they can direct contracts to oligarchs that they're close to, but also because they're just kind of visible, kind of symbolic, whereas the Japanese side is looking for smaller scale ones. And I think the Japanese side is in the better position here. Start small. Demonstrate that you can invest in Russia and have success, make a profit, and be protected from corruption and all the rest of it. And then, after that, other things would follow. But that doesn't seem to be how Russian politicians are seeing it. Thank you.
Can I add to that? Yeah, so I've also spent a fair amount of time in the Russian Far East, and I was in Moscow for 4 years, so it's a subject I'm interested greatly. One thing to realize is, because the question, I've had all the same conversations James has had with the local officials there and local business people there and about investment and so on. Look, there are only 6 million people in the entire Russian Far East. It's not a market in itself. So what's your, unless you're investing in extractive industries, which there already are. I mean, there already is investment in timber and oil and gas and so on. There's these fantasy life about you're going to set up factories and so on. And there isn't a labor force. There isn't a market. There's no real basis for making that kind of investment. I mean, the Koreans have been much more active in investing in there, and they're completely frustrated. I mean, there's a wonderful Hyundai engineering plant outside of Vladivostok that's sitting there, empty. I mean, they got so frustrated by trying to deal with the domestic bureaucracy and other politics. And, the Russians like to say, oh, well, the Koreans, they're a little more flexible, which is code word for they're willing to pay bribes, which Japanese companies won't do, and American companies won't do either. So, the reality is it's really hard to do this. And I think, what James is saying, Japanese is saying, well, let's do, smaller scale projects and get going that way. That isn't what's going on there. And I think that this idea that you can sort of go backwards, that is, you can build up economic investment in economic ties and then somehow make yourself get back to the larger geopolitical and strategic issues, I don't think works. And even though there's a lot of logic to cooperation. Certainly there is, but you need some people for one thing. That would help.
Siegfried Nidl, freelancer journalist from Germany. About negative attitude of the Japanese public changing paragraph 9. Has it not now much to do with the figure of Prime Minister Abe? What would happen with a Prime Minister Kono or Prime Minister Kishida? Would the attitude of the Japanese public change? Would it be more acceptable to change paragraph 9?
I think all of us might have a comment on that. What's interesting is the resistance to changing Article 9 has increased among the Japanese public since Abe took over. So even people who support changing Article 9 don't want it to happen under him, which speaks a lot about Abe's trust deficit. But I'm sure Dan might have more to add.
No, it's a good question, actually. It's an interesting question. I don't think so, because, look, the LDP has had, as it's part of its platform, since the formation of the LDP, 1955, the amendment of the Constitution, and specifically the amendment of Article 9. And I know many Japanese who are friends of mine who fundamentally believe that, this was an American-imposed, document, and, it's an issue of sovereignty, of pride, and so on, whether or not they're, interested in playing a larger military role or not. So I just think this issue's been there for a long time. It's a deep historical question. And I think the irony is, for the United States, because there are American officials who basically have supported amending the Constitution for a while, in some cases explicitly. Irony is that we did a really good job of implanting a deep pacifist consciousness in Japan. And, partly we did it through war. That is, we did it through the experience of the destruction of Japan and the dropping of 2 atomic weapons on Japan. But also, these things have been reinforced over time. And it's proven to be a really hard thing to change. I love, as a poll I love to cite, the Asahi did some years ago, where they were doing a poll looking at generational differences, and they asked, if Japan were invaded, would you fight? And I think the largest number of people who said, yes, of course we'll fight, were like over the age of 50. So, but the people who are of the age that could actually do that, in their 20s and 30s, only 13% said yes. So I thought to myself, wow, I mean, that's why one of the reasons why I have trouble worrying, I don't spend sleepless nights worrying about the return of Japanese militarism.
I think it's a very interesting question as to whether it would become more likely under a different prime minister. I would say no, in that it requires a lot of political capital and a huge amount of determination to make such an important change. And I think that other leaders might not be so committed to it. Clearly, Abe feels a real personal commitment to trying to change the constitution. It's also an uphill struggle for anyone, because Japanese governments have been saying for so long that, don't need to worry, the self-defense forces are constitutional. They've been making that argument for such a long time. So now to say, actually, we need another line or another kind of paragraph to say, yes, they're definitely constitutional, well, many people would say, well, why do we need that? You've been saying they're constitutional anyway. So I think it would be more difficult for other prime ministers.
Ken Moskowitz, adjunct here. I'd like to follow up on something which Professor Kingston said about the Japanese reaction to President Trump's America First policy, in that the Japanese view it as nothing new. Japan has been a client state since the occupation. It sounds that way from the term America First, but ironically, it seems that Trump is demanding what he would call more equality. That is, he has said, as Trump, the critic of U.S. foreign policy, Trump the candidate, Trump the president, that the Japanese are laughing at us because we provide free transport protection. in Japanese bringing oil from the Middle East. We're protecting the sea lanes. That Japan is getting free defense protection where Japan is strong enough and wealthy enough to protect itself. And finally, that the trade imbalance is something which is intolerable. There needs to be more equality in that dimension too. So in at least three ways, it seems that when it says America first and suggests inequality, it seems that Trump is actually demanding more equality in the relationship. Does that make sense?
Well, I think he certainly wants to demand more from Japan, but I don't think it's based on the premise of equality. I think that he wants Japan to do more for itself. He wants to, what he would say, level the playing field. He's also advocated Japan at one point developing nuclear weapons. He also made noises about paying more cost for hosting American troops here. But so Trump says a lot of things, and then they sort of drift away. I think, one of the lingering images is when Trump came here, met Abe, they went golfing, and Trump isn't a bad golfer, and Abe's a bit of a duffer. And Abe hit his shot into the bunker, and he had trouble, but he got down there, and his shot got back on the fairway, and as he climbed up to the top, he suddenly went tumbling back down. Now, where's Trump? Trump is striding down the fairway, oblivious of Abe's problems. So I think for a lot of Japanese, that scene, which went viral on video, speaks a lot about the relationship.
You brought to mind one other aspect, historical and contemporary, that the current case of Trump's acceptance of the summit with North Korea and blindsiding the Japanese very much recollects, to me, the blindsiding the Japanese in the case of Nixon going to China. So nothing's new in that arena.
Pulling the rug out from underneath Abe. Trump did it with TPP. As you say, Nixon shocks, there's a couple of them. So that's why I sense the America looking out for its own interest and subordinating Japanese interest to America, I don't think is all that new. The interesting thing is, I had his father as one of my seminar professors back at Columbia in the early 80s. And I'm sure he would be very surprised at the Abe doctrine. I don't think it's something that his father would. He was constantly complaining the Japanese weren't doing enough burden sharing. And I remember Zenko Suzuki said something controversial back in like 1980 or something, where he said something about, it was really uncontroversial, but he sort of stepped on the third rail about said something about defense or security or whatever, and the media here went berserk, and he had to say, "Oh no, I wasn't saying anything along those."
1,000-mile sea lane.
Something like that, yeah. And so the 1,000-mile, and so you're thinking, compared to what was controversial then and how far Japan has gone since then, I think it's a rather different world.
Well, yeah, as an explanation, my father was the sort of, as a Foreign Service officer, was an architect of probably the two most important parts of the U.S.-Japan security relationship, the revised security treaty and the reversion of Okinawa. And he would argue that, yes, it was, equity was always the issue. That was why we revised the security treaty, because the first security treaty was done under the occupation and was inherently and blatantly unequal. And the revised treaty was an attempt to create more equity in the relationship within the limits of Japanese constitutional restrictions, because Japan at that point could not and did not feel it could constitutionally exercise the right of collective self-defense. That's so there was this inherent inequity to it. We were committed to come to the defense of Japan, and Japan is not committed in a mutual way to come to our defense. That's a big difference between the security alliance we have with Japan and that we have with NATO. So I think inequity has been a constant of our relationship, but it's an evolving one. And yes, we've been asking the Japanese to do more from a burden sharing point of view for a long period of time. That's why I said I don't see this as a sharp break, what's going on now from the past. There is a long evolutionary pathway. But still, fundamentally, we haven't changed the nature of our security relationship. I don't have a problem with that, really, in the sense that it always has been a relationship of mutual benefit. The reality is, yes, we do. This is something Donald Trump has absolutely no understanding of, and I think, and no possibility of ever understanding, it seems. Yes, we provide the security guarantee to Japan, but Japan provides us, in return, the forward deployment of the United States military in all of East Asia and Western Asia. There's no more valuable asset for us outside of, the continental United States than the headquartering of the 7th Fleet in Japan and the headquartering of the 5th Air Force, which people don't understand. I mean, Kadena Air Force Base is the largest American Air Force base outside of the United States, and it's of massive strategic importance. And we could not have any presence in Asia without that. We couldn't defend Korea, certainly, and Koreans understand that, even though they don't like to talk about it, and Japanese understand it as well. The defense of Korea is absolutely based upon our presence and our security relationship with Japan. It's a very mutual relationship. It's not equal, but we have no equal relationships with anybody. I mean, we are a superpower in that sense. So equity, absolute equity, is not going to happen. But and I think we've moved towards a greater degree of true mutuality over time. And yes, the Japanese have weathered many a shock, of the nature of which is basically we are going to pursue what's in our national interests. And I think Japanese themselves are increasingly comfortable saying yes, and we're going to pursue what's in our national interest. I think the Japanese leadership on the TPP-11 is terrific, and it's a statement of Japan's national interest in defiance of the policies of the Trump administration. And that's great. That's a healthy change in our relationship, and it's a good one. I don't have a problem with any, Trump's problem, for me, America First, is not about equity. It's about abandonment of the American responsibility, which we took on. Frankly, we took it on inadvertently as a consequence of World War II, which was thrust upon us, if you will, the responsibility to construct a largely stable and peaceful world order, which has been, yes, to our benefit, but to the benefit, I think, of everybody in the world. And that is a global responsibility. And the retreat from that, which is what Donald Trump represents in my view, is not only dangerous, it's inimical to American national interest. And I think Japanese understand that a whole lot better than Americans do these days. But I'm hoping in a few months we'll find out what Americans understand and don't understand about Donald Trump. Sorry for that fervent response.
Perfectly okay, Professor Sneider. Jonathan Frymuth, I'm a senior here at TUJ. Thank you very much for all three of the illuminating perspectives on each of your categories tonight. My question had to actually deal with free trade, so I'm happy that you finished your point kind of talking about the TPP note. So with kind of the emerging specter protectionism kind of coming out of the United States right now, and Japan just kind of passing through the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement on the same day that the tariffs were enacted. I'm just curious as to maybe any of the panelists' perspectives on Japan's future engagement in kind of regional trade organizations, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or possibly for Professor Brown, the with Xi Jinping's loosening of term limits recently, one of his big pet projects is the One Belt, One Road. And should the belt portion, which is the overland, be completed, would it be possible that Japan would try to trade over the, Eurasian landmass? Would that not be a helpful thing, especially with the retreat of kind of U.S. neoliberalism more generally? So, thank you.
I mean, on the specific question of Japan's involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative, well, you hear from the Japanese side that they haven't closed the door on potential participation with the forum that was held. They sent Mr. Nikai there to sort of demonstrate that they were still open to that idea. I don't know. I mean, in my own view, I find it perhaps unlikely that Japan is going to be enthusiastically participating in the BRI. They have shown in many other ways that they are very suspicious, very hesitant about China's large-scale projects, and I think that rather they would much prefer, if possible, to push forward with alternative frameworks. So I'd be very surprised.
I think that I'm very interested in conversations I've had with the Japanese officials who are leading this TPP-11 process, and one of them said to me that this has been a really formative experience for them, that they've approached all trade negotiations, multilateral as well as the bilateral trade negotiations, basically as a reactive partner. The U.S. proposing something, Japanese basically engaging in some type of bargaining to protect their interests and so on. And to have the experience of actually leading a multilateral trade process and having to deal with the complicated sort of GATT-style bargains that have to go on. I mean, he was complaining to me, he says, oh my God, I said, having to deal with the Mexicans and the Canadians, he says, now I know how difficult this was for you. But he said, but it was a really, I think, transformative experience for them. I mean, to actually take, these were serious negotiations. They went through many, many rounds on this last TPP-11, and I think it's going to have a longer-term impact. I think someone was asking me the other day about RCEP, and I don't know where RCEP is at in the sort of process, but I think everybody knew that RCEP was a phony trade agreement. It doesn't involve the bargaining that actually goes on in multilateral trade negotiations. And I think that it'll be interesting to see. I mean, one of the things interesting is that when Trump kind of dropped this statement at Davos about how, well, maybe, we'll think about rejoining TPP if we can renegotiate it to be for our liking, the Japanese didn't roll over. They didn't roll over at all. They said, well, no, actually, we're not going to renegotiate all this. It's too difficult to do it. They knew what actually is involved in doing that, and it's not going to happen that way, which I thought, I mean, there are limits. I mean, I know that Abe has spent a lot of time cultivating his role as a Trump whisperer, but, there clearly are limits to that. And I think, again, as I said before, I think this is a healthy emergence of Japanese leadership. And I think when it comes to dealing with the Chinese, because, what's One Belt, One Road? As far as I can tell, it's a big Chinese construction project, paid for by the Chinese for Chinese companies and Chinese workers. And, people who are the recipients of this, to the extent to which they take the money, they take it with a wink and a nod. And they understand what's going on. So I don't know that, but whereas the Japanese are actually talking about doing serious infrastructure projects in a number of places, and I think, great, maybe they'll create their own, I mean, the ADB already exists, so in some sense it was the Japanese version of, the AIIB long before there was one. So maybe that'll revive in some way, I don't know.
Hi, I'm Gamuto from a mobile company, like mobile app company, and I have thank you for presentations, and I have a question for Professor Brown. So, Professor Brown, one of your points was a behavior of Japanese prime ministers when they're like with a president from Russia. And I also think the behaviors of them was sometimes kind of awkward, weird, or lame. So, and however, some of my friends from my junior high and high school are like kind of make an effort to be a prime minister in Japan in the future. So please tell me if you have any advices for not being awkward when they're with.
Do they have to take off their shirt?
That's one idea, but yeah, it's well, I don't think this is specific to the Japan-Russia relationship, that sometimes there is personal chemistry between leaders and sometimes there's not. And you can't really create it when it's not there. Sometimes when the relationship is so important, when there are other kind of factors pushing the sides together, then it doesn't really matter that much. So I don't really believe there's much personal chemistry between Putin and President Xi of China, but they sort of fake it, and it's easier for them to do it because there's so much pushing them together at the moment. With Putin and Japan, there's nothing to say that other Japanese wouldn't get on well with him. Indeed, he has a good relationship with former Prime Minister Mori, who was in power right at the beginning of Putin's term. And they get on well, and they've continued to meet periodically over the years. Putin's best Japanese friend, however, is the former judo champion Yamashita. And they get on really well. And it's funny that I showed a photo of Putin and Abe actually getting on quite well. And there's a photo of Putin sort of reaching across and they're laughing. But it's like the only one of actually apparent kind of real connection. And there are other photos from that same event where actually Abe is sitting on his own, looking rather sort of bored. And Putin is chatting away really happily with Yamashita, who's sitting on the other side. So, I mean, it's difficult. There's no, I think, really easy way to do it. Sometimes there's personal chemistry. Of course, it helps if you have shared interest. Putin genuinely is passionate about judo, and Abe is not really a sportsman, as we've heard already.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Takeda. I work for a manufacturing company. The company works on a project in Moscow under the agreement of 2016 Abe-Putin meeting. And I have a question for Mr. James Brown. The Abe-Putin meeting was held after the US presidential election. So in my opinion, if Ms. Clinton won the election, the President Putin made a concession about the territorial issues. Is the result is different if Clinton won the election?
Thank you very much. No, I don't think so. That, as I was saying earlier on, one of the kind of obstacles to the relationship is that when relations between Russia and the United States are bad, that makes it very hard for progress to be made between Japan and Russia. So what would have happened in relations between the US and Russia under a Clinton presidency? Well, I mean, all of the talk prior to the election was the fact that Hillary Clinton was much more hawkish on Russia, and that in an ideal world, or an ideal world for Trump, then relations between the US and Russia would be much closer. So I think there would be every opportunity for there to be major tensions between the US and Russia had Clinton had won, and I think that would have spilled over in some way into having a negative influence on the relationship between Russia and Japan as well. So I can't really see how it would have led to Russia making concessions.
Tenny Christiana from Waseda University. My question to Professor Jeff Kingston. So during the Cold War period, Indonesia leader, first president Sukarno is bring Indonesia a good relation with Soviet Union and China at that time, and the communist is pretty good in Indonesia during 1960s. And that time is Japan have a good relation with Indonesia too, and Japan give a lot of like aid and also like ODA to Indonesia. I wonder at that time, Japan have maintained good relation with Indonesia more into economic interests, or it's related to Japan-America alliance on the containment or on communists in Southeast Asia?
Good question. The interesting thing, yeah, they did have a very good relationship with Sukarno. They then went on to have a very good relationship with Suharto. And in democratic post-New Order Indonesia, they maintained good relations. So Indonesia is a good example of how Japan has navigated the political changes reasonably well. With Sukarno, they had, of course, the inside track. He came here and married a nightclub hostess at the Copacabana, so they had somebody on the inside. I think that Sukarno essentially drove the economy into the ditch. Suharto took over in a military coup. Japan then led what's called the Intergovernmental Group on Indonesia, which provided fresh financing, rolled over existing loans, helped rehabilitate the Indonesian economy. And so Suharto owes a lot of his development success, I think, to the strong support Japan gave over the years. The problem is because Suharto was an authoritarian leader and had a lot of blood on his hands, being closely tied with him, you think might actually harm Japan's post-New Order relationship with democratic leaders. But they've been fairly astute, I think, in cultivating the new leaders, and right now have a good working relationship with Jokowi. So I think the reason why Japan has been flexible is because of the natural resources, the huge market potential, and this geostrategic location. And this is all, of course, connected with U.S. interests there in the region as well. Back again.
Siegfried Nittel again. About leadership in Asia, Mr. Sneider, you said Japan is in the TPP process, got a leader in the TPP 11 process. But did this not happen before in the Indo-Pacific discussion, or in the what's called Quad? I think Mr. Abe was the first who talked about politicians have talked about Indo-Pacific region, and I think he developed this kind of concept of the Quad and this kind of four countries kind of alliance. He wrote an article some years ago in Pro Syndicate about a diamond from Japan, Australia, Hawaii, and India. So does he not want to be a kind of a leader in this process to develop a kind of alliance in this region?
I was at a conference a while ago that I was involved in organizing, and I think I can say this. Mr. Kanehara, who's a deputy chief in the Prime Minister's Secretariat for Foreign Affairs, and is deputy to Mr. Yanai, and he very proudly talked about Abe's authorship of the term Indo-Pacific. Okay, I'll give him, trademark on that one. I'm not sure. I have to go back and do a Google search, but maybe he was the first leader to use it. Although, but honestly, at the point, my recollection is at the point that during his first premiership, when he was pushing these ideas, it was in the midst of the Bush administration's own kind of frankly, sort of partly a construct of the neoconservatives in the Bush administration, but also this sort of shift towards an alleged democracy promotion driven American foreign policy. I don't know if you recall the President Bush's, I don't know why anyone should, but anyway, I do recall his second inaugural address in 2004, in which he said, you know, that the purpose of American foreign policy is the spreading of democracy. It was a rather radical Wilsonian statement. And so I don't know that who has the intellectual authorship here. I always felt that Abe was to some degree riding on that that concept. And there is, in American foreign policy circles, been long discussion of a kind of soft containment strategy towards China that was built on this idea of an Indo-Japan, U.S. I don't know if Australia was always included in it, but anyway, kind of containment axis, if you will. I mean, and that even precedes, frankly, the Bush administration. I mean, you know, I've seen this talk for a long time, going back to when the, you know, when the Indo-U.S. relationship really went through a huge shift starting in the Clinton administration, and sort of out of the Cold War construct of Indian foreign policy. So, I mean, there are a lot of, you know, there are a lot of people who can claim authorship of this, and but, you know, it's clearly sort of au courant at the moment. But, you know, by the way, the U.S. Pacific Command, wonderful people in Hawaii, have been using the term Indo-Pacific for quite a while. It is the operating concept in PACOM because their command area stretches from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, and they like that idea of looking at it strategically across there. So many people can claim authorship on this one.
Hello, thank you very much for very stimulating presentations. My name's Joan Anderson from Soka Gakkai International, and I have two questions. One is about the situation regarding nuclear weapons in Asia and how you, I know there are some very big unpredictable factors in there at the moment, but how you see the relevance of nuclear weapons in the region in the future going forward. And then my second question is a request. Reading the Japan Times on Sunday has become very much less interesting recently, thanks to the demise of Jeff Kingston's column. So could I request that the three of you take turns, and then it won't be quite so tough on Professor Kingston? How about that?
Take turns doing what?
To do the articles in the Sunday Japan Times that I used to look forward to so
Jeff's
much.
banned, so
He's banned, oh I see. Didn't realize that. Anyway, thank you.
Well, I don't know whether I'm banned, but anyway, so they had to make space, so my space needed to be used otherwise. But you know, it may be boring for you, but it's been rather liberating for me. I've had a lot more time to do my other writing, so that's good. Nuclear weapons, I think the really interesting thing is the way that Trump has essentially tried to renege on the Iranian nuclear deal, sort of paints him in the corner on North Korea. Why would Kim Jong-un think that any agreement that he might reach with Trump would be worth the paper it's written on? So that alone, I think, makes me rather skeptical that there's going to be a lot of progress on denuclearization of the peninsula anytime soon. So I don't know, the relevance of nuclear weapons, I'm not quite sure how to address that, but I do remember his father spilled the beans back in 1980 when he told us something that was really secret, and we were all like, really? The United States actually was keeping tactical nuclear weapons in Okinawa at the time, which violated...
Not in 1980.
Not in 1980, but previously during when Prime Minister Sato had the 3 nuclear no's, and the Americans were violating that, and we were told the Japanese were fully aware of this violation. Anyway, I think that Dan and James might have more interesting things to say about the nuclear relevance.
Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I thought I'd just take the opportunity to link it back to some things to do with Japan and Russia, because when you're talking about nuclear weapons, clearly Russia plays such an important role. And the Russian side has been incredibly disappointed, I think, by the decision about Aegis Ashore. Within Japan, it's not really been, a controversial decision. In most quarters, people have accepted the argument that at a time when Japan is clearly threatened by North Korean missiles, there should be no real objection to Japan having an additional missile defense system. But the Russian side have been very, very strongly against this, and they lobbied Japan very hard to try and encourage them not to go for this. So Russia raised it at the 2+2 that was held in March 2017. Indeed, when Putin was in Yamaguchi in December 2016, he also raised it with Abe. And last year, the Russian embassy held a special event in order to highlight the way in which missile defense is actually a destabilizing and kind of damaging move, because their argument is that this is actually just a pretext. It's not related to North Korea. Instead, it's just being used by the United States, in their view, as an excuse to strengthen their missile defense system, which is really targeted at Russia. And that is why Russia then, kind of responded in the way it did, in a very aggressive way, in Putin's recent speech with the video and all of the rest of it. Now, these things were obviously in the works previously, but they see that the expansion of US missile defense systems is something which is undermining Russian security. Russia's conventional forces are much weaker than they were during the Cold War, and so Russia depends much more on its nuclear weapons than it did previously. So how does this affect relations between Russia and Japan? Well, subsequent to Japan's decision to deploy Aegis Ashore, Russia has taken a step to enable its airport on Iturup, the largest of the disputed islands, to be used by military aviation as well as kind of civilian flights. So that essentially opens the way for returning kind of military jets to the island. Also carrying out those SNAP exercises previously, that also seems to be related to Aegis Ashore. So it's a major factor in the Japan-Russia relationship too.
Well, I have to just say, I don't know any. I've been writing about actually nuclear weapons for a long time. In fact, I have a piece on extended deterrence in the latest issue of Asia Policy. But, I don't find Russian objections to missile defense systems very credible, since they know perfectly well they can overwhelm any missile defense system, including anything which the United States could put up in the continental United States, much less these limited defense systems here. I think if anything, they want to justify what Putin was presenting, which is a huge expansion of the role of nuclear weapons and delivery of nuclear weapons in Russian military policy. And you can argue the U.S. is doing that too in the latest NPR, National Nuclear Posture Review. But, for better or for worse, we're living still in the era where nuclear weapons are a part of the arsenals of the major powers, and in which we have doctrine to guide their use as if we would actually use them in war, although I don't think anyone seriously envisions that happening. But as long as they're there, militaries are going to plan for them. And the issue in Japan, interestingly, and by the way, the presence of American nuclear weapons on Okinawa was not a violation of the non-nuclear principle, since Okinawa was still under American administration at that time. But technically, yeah, they're the residual sovereign power. That was why we had to return Okinawa without nuclear weapons. But I think the issue for Japan, Japanese actually policymakers are very concerned about the viability of American extended deterrence. That is the commitment of the United States to maintain the nuclear umbrella over Japan. That takes us back to the America First question, and to what degree we remain a reliable ally. And I think we have to be credible, and our nuclear deterrent has to be credible for the time being, for the extended time being, or we risk the danger that our allies will seek to develop nuclear weapons themselves, and that includes Japan, because they don't trust that security guarantee.
Well, thank
Robert.
you very much. We've almost reached the end. We actually really reached the end. So if you have any concluding comments? No. Good. Well, I would...
Go buy the book.
That's what I was going to say.
And buy copies for your friends, and your parents, and everybody else. Thank you very much. It's a great book.
Thanks again to all our panelists for...
And thank you, Robert, for having us.
And thank you and congratulations to all the contributors, some of whom couldn't be here, but we thank them. And as Jeff said, we encourage you to buy the book. Is it possible to leave this building without buying it?
Yeah, because there are none currently available.
Oh, okay, okay.
Hot item.
Yes, so do order your copy. Make sure you give it as a birthday present to your friends. If you're invited to a wedding, it's an outstanding wedding gift. You can also bring it to funerals also. So do, and thanks again. And next week, we have Brad Glosserman, who's going to talk about the impact of Trump's policies on Asia.
He has a chapter in this book, too.
And he has a chapter in this book. So thanks again. Bye.